house was dark when I pulled into the driveway. That should have been my first sign. My brother's truck was gone, my parents' sedan was gone, and the porch light, the one my mother never, not once in 30 years, left off after sunset, was dark. I sat in my car for a moment with the engine running, thinking maybe they'd all gone out for dinner without me. Maybe they'd texted and I missed it. I checked my phone. Nothing. I went inside anyway. The kitchen smelled like coffee, recently brewed, and there was a single mug in the sink. Someone had been here not long before me. I called out. Nobody answered. I walked through the living room, down the hallway, and that's when I saw it. A folded piece of paper on the kitchen table with my name on it. Not my full name. Just my first name, written in my mother's handwriting. You'll understand when you're ready. We had to do this. The business can't survive the way things are going. This is the only way to make it right. Don't try to reach us. I read it 3 times. I turned it over. Nothing on the back. I had no idea what I was looking at. Let me back up, because none of this will make sense without the context that I spent years trying to pretend didn't matter. My family owns a construction company. My grandfather started it in the 1970s out of a single truck and a handshake reputation. By the time my father took it over, it had grown into something real, a regional operation, maybe 40 employees at peak season, contracts with commercial developers, a name people recognized. I grew up in that company the way some kids grew up in churches. It was the first thing I thought about in the morning and the last thing I thought about at night, not because I was passionate about it from birth, but because it was everywhere. The dinner table, the holidays, my father's mood on any given day. When I was 22, fresh out of a civil engineering program, my father brought me in officially. I was paid, barely, and I worked more than I was paid for, which I thought was normal, which I was told was normal. You're building equity. You're building your future. One day, this is yours. What I didn't know, what nobody told me, was that my brother had taken out a second mortgage on the company's primary property without telling my father. What I didn't know was that my uncle, my father's younger brother who handled the books, had been skimming for 3 years. Not catastrophic amounts. Enough. Enough that when the commercial contracts dried up during the slowdown, there was no cushion and the bank noticed. By the time I found out any of this, I was 29 years old and the company was hemorrhaging money. And somehow I still don't fully understand the logic. I had become the problem. I was the one who'd pushed for the commercial contracts that didn't renew. I was the one who'd hired the subcontractor who went over budget. I was the one who'd recommended the software upgrade that nobody used. Every bad decision that had happened in 2 years was, in retrospect, mine. That's how it was framed. That's how my father started saying it, and then my brother started saying it, and then it was just fact. I didn't fight it hard enough. That's something I'd had to sit with. I was so used to being the one who kept my head down and absorbed the criticism and kept working that I didn't recognize it for what it was until too late. That summer, my uncle suggested a family retreat, a long weekend at the lake property my grandparents had left to the family, a shared inheritance, technically, split among 4 siblings, including my father. Cabins, a dock, acres of woods. He said it was to talk through the business situation, get on the same page, clear the air. I thought that was a good sign. I thought it meant we were going to actually talk. I drove up Friday afternoon. My parents were already there, my brother and his wife, my uncle and aunt. We had dinner together that night and it was almost normal. Almost. There were moments where conversations stopped when I walked into a room, moments where my brother and my uncle exchanged looks I wasn't supposed to see. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself this was a fresh start. Saturday morning, I woke up early and took a walk down to the dock by myself. The lake was flat and gray in the early light, and I stood there for about 20 minutes, just breathing, trying to settle something that had been sitting in my chest for months. When I came back to the main cabin, everyone was gone. I mean everyone. Cars gone. Bags gone. Coffee cold in the pot. Food cleared out of the refrigerator. Not all of it, but most of it. Enough to make clear this wasn't an emergency. This was deliberate. And that note on the table, I want to tell you I handled it calmly. I want to tell you I immediately started problem solving. The truth is, I sat in that cabin for about 2 hours doing nothing. Not crying, not thinking, just sitting. There's a particular kind of shock that comes from being hurt by people you genuinely did not believe would hurt you, and it doesn't feel like pain right away. It feels like the absence of something, like the floor is still there, but you've stopped trusting it. Eventually, I started taking stock. My phone had service, barely, one bar that came and went. I tried calling my father. Straight to voicemail. My mother. Same. My brother. Same. My uncle. Same. I sent texts, I sent emails, nothing. I went back through the note. Don't try to reach us. They had planned this. The nearest town was 14 miles down a logging road that I'd driven in on. I had my car, which was the one thing they'd left me. Maybe because they didn't think to take the keys? Or maybe because they wanted me to have a way home and just couldn't bring themselves to leave me completely stranded. I'm still not sure which. Either explanation says something terrible about them. What I didn't have was money. My wallet had my license and one credit card. When I tried the card at a gas station on the way toward town, it declined. I tried it again, declined. I found out later that my brother had called the bank. I was an authorized user on a business account he controlled, and he'd revoked my access 2 days before the trip without telling me. I had $11 in cash and half a tank of gas. I drove to the nearest town, a place called Millhaven, about 3,000 people, a Dollar General and a diner and a gas station. I sat in the parking lot of that diner for a long time trying to figure out what to do. I had no family I could call. My father's siblings were all part of this, and my mother's family lived across the country, and I hadn't spoken to them in years because my parents had made that difficult in ways I'd never fully examined. I had friends, but the kind of friends you lose track of when you spend your entire 20s working for your family. Acquaintances. People I'd text on birthdays. There was one person I called, a guy I'd known since high school, someone who'd stayed local and who I'd had lunch with a few months earlier. I'll call him my friend because that's what he was, one of the last real ones I had. I told him what happened. There was a long silence on the phone. "Where are you?" he said. I told him, "Stay there." He drove 4 hours that day. He brought cash and food, and he didn't ask me to explain anything I wasn't ready to explain. We sat in that diner for 2 hours, and I went through everything I knew. The note, the missing cars, the declined card, the unanswered calls, and he listened without saying much, and then he said the thing that I needed to hear, which was simple. "This is not your fault, and you're going to be okay, and we're going to figure out what actually happened here." I didn't believe him, but I needed to hear it. I want to tell you what happened with the business, because that's where the real story is. While I was sitting in that lake cabin that morning, while I was driving to Millhaven, while I was sitting in the diner, a meeting was happening. A meeting I didn't know about and hadn't been invited to. My uncle had arranged over the previous month a restructuring agreement with a private investor, a developer my family had done business with for years. The terms of the agreement required that the primary ownership of the company be consolidated. My father held 40%, my uncle held 30%, my brother held 20%, I held 10%. A stake my grandfather had left me directly, structured in a way my father had never been able to touch. That 10% was the problem. In order to finalize the restructuring, the investor required majority control. My father and uncle and brother collectively held 90%. But the agreement required unanimous consent from all shareholders for the restructuring to proceed. My 10%, which I would never have agreed to sign away, was the one thing standing between my family and their deal. They needed me out of the picture, not killed. I want to be clear that I don't believe anyone wanted me physically harmed. What they needed was for me to be destabilized, panicked, financially cut off, isolated. They needed me to come back desperate and willing to sign whatever they put in front of me. The forest, the lake, the abandoned cabin, none of that was the trap. The trap was the document waiting for me back home. I found this out slowly, over about 2 weeks. Through a combination of a lawyer my friend helped me find and a conversation with a former company accountant who had been quietly furious about my uncle's conduct for 2 years and was, as it turned out, willing to talk. The accountant told me about the skimming. She told me about the second mortgage my brother had taken out. She told me about the investor meeting that had happened the morning I woke up alone at the lake. She had documentation. She had emails. She had more than I would have ever found on my own. I want to tell you about the moment I understood all of it clearly, because it didn't feel like rage, which is what I expected. It felt like grief. It felt like losing something I'd been holding on to for a long time. The version of my family where this wasn't possible. where my father was difficult but not cruel, where my brother was jealous but not willing to actually harm me, where my mother was passive but not complicit. I had to let go of all of those versions at once. That took longer than the legal process. My lawyer was a woman about 15 years older than me, who had a small practice in the city and who specialized in business disputes. When I first walked into her office and explained the situation, she didn't say much. She just started taking notes. When I finished, she looked up and said, "The good news is they made a lot of mistakes. The bad news is this is going to take time." She was right on both counts. The first move was an injunction to freeze any transfer of company assets while the matter was under review. My uncle and brother hadn't finalized the deal yet. They'd been waiting for the meeting with me that never happened, where they planned to present me with the paperwork in a vulnerable state and pressure me to sign. We filed before that meeting could be rescheduled. My father called me when he heard about the injunction. It was the first time I'd spoken to him in 3 weeks. He didn't apologize. He told me I was making a mistake. He told me the company would fail without the restructuring and that I would be the one responsible. He used the same voice he'd always used when he wanted me to stop arguing. Not angry, just certain. Just the voice that said the conversation is over. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the pull to fall in line. "I know what you did," I said. "I know why you did it, and I'm not signing anything." He hung up. My mother called an hour later. She cried. She said she didn't know they were going to leave me like that. She thought it was only going to be for a few hours. She thought someone was going to palm me. She said my uncle had assured her it would be fine. I believed parts of that and didn't believe other parts. And I said something I'd been thinking for years. "You knew enough to say no. You just didn't." She didn't respond to that. We said goodbye. I don't know if I'll speak to her again, and I've had to make my peace with not knowing. The accountant agreed to testify. That was the turning point. My uncle and brother had expected me to either sign the paperwork quickly or fight it alone with no resources. They hadn't accounted for someone who had been watching them for 2 years and had been waiting for a reason to speak. When my lawyer presented the documentation, the skimming records, the mortgage my brother had hidden, the emails about the investor meeting, my uncle's lawyer asked for a recess after about 40 minutes. The restructuring deal collapsed. The investor, it turned out, had not been told about the outstanding second mortgage or the accountant's records. When his legal team saw what was actually in the company's books, they walked. My uncle spent the next several months dealing with the consequences of that, which I will not pretend I didn't feel something about. My brother settled. He signed an agreement acknowledging what he'd taken from the company and agreed to a repayment structure. He didn't speak to me at the settlement. He looked at the table the whole time. I don't know what I wanted from him. Some acknowledgement, maybe. Some indication that he understood what he'd done. I didn't get it that day. My 10% stake was worth more after the dust settled than anyone had calculated, because the skimming had been depressing the apparent value of the company for years. With accurate books and a second mortgage addressed, the company was restructured on terms my father had to accept. Terms that included me having a real seat at the table, or being bought out at fair value. I chose the buyout. I want to be honest about what the aftermath actually looked like, because I think when people hear a story like this, they imagine a clean ending. A clear moment when justice lands and everything clicks into place and you feel vindicated and whole. That's not how it felt. The legal process took 14 months. During that time, I was surviving on the buyout advance my lawyer negotiated, living in a 1-bedroom apartment in a city I didn't know well, building a freelance consulting work history from scratch because my resume for the previous 7 years was essentially worked for family company. I had good weeks and bad weeks. I had weeks where I lay awake at 3 in the morning, running the math on whether I'd made the right decisions, whether I should have tried harder to save the company, whether there was some version of this where I held the family together and also held my own ground. There isn't. I've come to believe that. But it took time. What helped? The thing that actually helped was the work. I started taking small consulting contracts, mostly with mid-sized construction firms that needed someone who understood operations and project management from the inside. I was good at it in ways I hadn't known I was good at it, because when you spend years absorbing blame for everything that goes wrong, you stop trusting your own competence. It took doing the work somewhere else, for people who evaluated me without a family narrative attached, to remember what I actually knew how to do. My friend came out a few more times during those 14 months. He'd drive out, we'd get dinner. He'd ask how things were going and actually listen to the answer. I don't think he knows how much that mattered. Maybe he does. I've tried to tell him. The last court date was a Thursday in November. I sat in a conference room with my lawyer, and my uncle's lawyer, and my brother's lawyer, and a mediator, and it was quieter than I expected. No audience, no dramatic moment. Just paperwork and signatures and the mediator reading terms out loud in a flat voice. When it was over, I walked out to the parking lot and stood in the cold for a while. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel relieved exactly. I felt like something was finished. Like a door I'd been holding open for a long time had finally been allowed to close. My lawyer came out after me and said, "How are you doing?" "I'm okay," I said. "You did the hard part," she said. "Most people in your position would have signed the papers." I thought about that. I thought about the cabin and the cold coffee and the note on the table. I thought about the $11 in my wallet and the declined card and driving to a town I'd never heard of. "I didn't feel like I had a choice," I said. She nodded. "Most brave things don't feel like a choice at the time. My grandfather built that company on the idea that your word was the thing nobody could take from you. He used to say it at family dinners when I was a kid, and I used to roll my eyes the way you do when a grandparent repeats something. And I used to think it was just an old man's principle with no practical application. I understand it differently now. Your word, your name, your integrity, whatever you want to call it, it's not just moral currency. It's structural. It's what holds together the thing you're building when everything else gets stripped away. My family stripped away the money and the access and the network and the job. They couldn't strip away what I actually knew how to do and who I actually was. They didn't know that was what I had. I'm not sure I did either. I'm 31 now. I have a 2-person firm with a partner I met through one of those early consulting contracts. We're small and careful and we sleep at night. I have an apartment I chose and a life that is, for the first time, entirely mine, not built around a family narrative, not held hostage to anyone's version of what I'm supposed to be. I don't have a relationship with my father. I don't have a relationship with my brother or my uncle. My mother and I have spoken a few times. Cautious conversations that haven't resolved into anything yet. Maybe they will. I try not to need them to. What I have is this: the knowledge that when they took everything they could think to take, I figured out how to keep going anyway. That's not a small thing. Some days it's the only thing. The cabin at the lake is part of the estate dispute now, tied up in a separate proceeding. I have no interest in it. Some places are only worth what you decide to leave behind in them. I left behind a version of myself that kept waiting for the family to become what he needed them to be. That was the thing worth leaving. I've thought a lot about what actually undid them. It wasn't the injunction. It wasn't the accountant's records, or the emails my lawyer put on the table, or the investor walking away when he saw what the books actually said. All of that mattered, but none of it was the root of it. What undid them was the assumption that I would fold. That's the thing about people who've watched you absorb blame your whole life. They start to mistake your patience for weakness. They see someone who keeps his head down and keeps working and doesn't make scenes, and they decide that person has no spine. They factor that into their plans. They leave that person alone at a cabin 14 miles from the nearest town with $11 and a declined card, and they expect him to come home scared and desperate and ready to sign whatever they put in front of him. They were wrong about who I was. I think part of me was wrong about who I was too. I spent most of my 20s inside a story my family wrote about me. I was the one who made the bad hires, pushed the wrong contracts, recommended the software nobody used. I accepted those assignments because I didn't have the distance to see them clearly. When you're inside something that long, a family business, a family narrative, a version of yourself that was built for someone else's convenience, you stop questioning the frame. You just try to do better within it. What the cabin did, as brutal as it was remove the frame entirely. There was no company to salvage that morning, no relationship to protect, no version of keeping the peace available to me. There was just the cold and the quiet and a note that told me the people I'd given my best years to had calculated that I was worth more as a problem removed than as a person kept. That clarity is a strange gift. I wouldn't wish it on anyone. I'm also not sure I'd be who I am now without it. The accountant had been watching what my uncle was doing for 2 years. 2 years of records. 2 years of quiet anger. 2 years of waiting for a reason. I think about that sometimes, about how the truth was already there, already documented, already waiting. My family's plan depended on me never finding it. They came so close to being right. My friend drove 4 hours that day without being asked twice. He showed up with cash and food and the kind of steadiness that reminded me what loyalty actually looks like when it's real. I think about the people in my life now, my business partner, my lawyer, the handful of friends who stayed through the 14 months of legal grinding. And I think about how different they are from the people I was raised to call family. Not because they're perfect, because they chose to stay and they didn't ask for anything in return for staying. That's the only definition of family that has ever held up for me under pressure. There's a version of this story where I sign the papers, where I come back shaken and broke and I sit across from my father and I let him be certain, one more time, and I hand over the 10% that was always mine. That version exists. I almost lived it. What stopped me was not courage in any dramatic sense. It was just the recognition, sitting in a diner parking lot in a town I'd never heard of, that I had nothing left to protect except my own judgment. And for the first time, that felt like enough. The people who hurt you the most are often the people who know you best. They know which version of you to aim for. They know your habits, your doubts, your tendency to give people the benefit of the doubt one more time. That knowledge is a weapon in the wrong hands. The only answer I've found is to know yourself better than they do. To be so clear on what you will and won't accept that there's no version of their plan that works. I'm not there yet. I don't think anyone ever fully gets there. But I'm closer than I was the morning I walked back from the dock and found the cabin empty. That morning broke something in me. It also built something. I'm still figuring out which was more important,